Ooh, that was loud.
Ooh, all right. Welcome all, and please do while I'm talking, you might want to put your mutes on, your mute while I'm talking. Okay, welcome. Today I want to talk to you a little bit. We're introducing this space and the places that we're going to be talking about in this course. Our course focuses on old Russia, so we're going to primarily be focusing on the origins of what becomes the Russian state and really kind of digging in to the 16th and early 17th century, that early modern period. But today I want to make sure that we have on our radar screen some clarity about geopolitical terms, and geopolitical referring to that by which a state is named, a political entity that humans form. Although the farther back in time we go, state entities and certainly what their boundaries are tend to be murky. There are 5 geopolitical entities that I want you to know, just as it's written in our learning objectives for the syllabus. And those entities are Rus, Muscovy, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and Russia, or the Russian Federation. Russia and the Russian Federation are the same thing. All of these have some geographical overlap, but they're distinct entities. And so to just get clear on that matter of definitions, what those entities are, I'm gonna work backwards in time chronologically. And so the first entity I will get clear on is Russia, or the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation is a state that has existed since 1991 to now. And that President Vladimir Putin is the president of Russia, and he has been since the year 2000, except for a hiatus in 2008 to 2012 when Dmitry Medvedev was the president. And so that is the Russian Federation. Prior to the Russian Federation, what existed was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, or the USSR, which stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was an entity that existed from 1922 to 1991. Now, really the events of 1917 set the Soviet Union in motion. The Soviet Union was what came after the Russian Empire. We'll get to that. But in 1917, there was 2 revolutions, essentially. The Tsar abdicated in early 1917, and what had been the Russian Empire established a provisional government that was trying to work out how it would establish a system of participatory politics and constitutionalism in the midst of World War I. And before they could pull that off, in October 1917, they were overthrown by a group of revolutionaries that stormed the Winter Palace, ousted the provisional government, and said, "We are setting up the government." Those were the Bolsheviks. Of course, a lot of people weren't going along, and it took fighting a civil war for a couple of years before that was sorted out. And the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally established only in 1922, and it existed until 1991. So, it comprised 15 republics. Comprised is such a tricky word. Always think of this. The deck comprises 52 cards. The United States comprises 50 states and some other things. The USSR comprised 15 republics for most of its existence. Some of them were late comers, but that was the Soviet Union. And you all, many of you are young enough that you, probably the majority now, I'm getting old, were born after the Soviet Union never existed, but you've certainly heard of it because all of you had parents in the Cold War, and the Cold War was an ideological binary as well as a political rivalry that really shaped the consciousness of many Americans in that mid 20th century period. So you've all heard of the Soviet Union, I trust, even if you weren't alive during it. Now, what happened? What existed prior to the Soviet Union? Prior to the Soviet Union, we had the Russian Empire. When exactly it began is something we can talk about in this course. Some big candidates are, does it begin in the 1470s? Does it begin in the mid 16th century when Muscovy conquers the Muslim Khanate of Kazan? Does it begin at a different time? That's something we can talk about. But if we're unclear exactly when the Russian Empire begins, we know that it ends in 1917 when the Tsar abdicates. And just to kind of, while we're talking kind of objective definitions and things like that, Tsar Nicholas II, who abdicated in 1917, was the last Tsar of the Romanov dynasty. The Romanov dynasty existed from 1613 to, 1613 to 1917. Prior to that, we had a period of state collapse that we're going to talk about in depth in this course. And before that, what was called the Rurikid dynasty existed from the 800s, again, murky beginnings, but we know when it ended in 1598 with the death of Ivan the Terrible's son. So for all of the history of the Russian Empire, there are effectively, except for this, interregnum time of troubles, 1598 to 1613, all of Russian imperial history, two dynasties, the Rurikids from the 9th century to 1598, and the Romanovs from 1613 to 1917. So that is the period of, so that period we call the Russian Empire. And it will, when you kind of start to dig in and think about who lives in this territory and even who's calling the shots and our elites in this territory, you find that the farther back in time we go, the more diverse it is, and that there are many different types of people that live on this land. Here roughly is a map of what covered the Russian Empire. Here in an even more schematic way, just to kind of show you at its greater extent how much territory it had, and that purple is land acquired under Peter, and then it even extended across the Bering Strait into Russia and Alaska until it sold it back to, well, not sold it back, listen to me sounding like a teleological American, when it sold that territory to the United States of America in the mid 19th century. So the Russian Empire became huge and it expanded gradually. But that is this entity that exists for centuries. Interestingly, you may have noticed the territory of the Russian Empire corresponded quite closely to the territory of the Soviet Union, which is a unexpected outcome given that the Soviet Union based itself on a Marxist ideology, fundamental to which was the rejection of imperialist practices. Go figure. At any rate, so what existed before the Russian Empire, before Muscovy, before we would really say this was an empire? The answer is Muscovy. And Muscovy is the way that I would have you define Muscovy is Russia up until Peter the First. And so maybe Russia from the 1300s to Peter the First. Again, details are murky, and as we move through the evolution of this state, you'll see why. So I'm never gonna be too precise about using the term Muscovy instead of Russia. In fact, it's fine with me if you use the term Russia instead of Muscovy. Many scholars do, many historians do. In fact, I had a conversation at a conference recently, and Paul Bushkovich, who is a very distinguished historian nearing retirement at Yale University and the author of this book, which I recommend you in your syllabus, he said, I think we shouldn't use the term Muscovy at all and I said, my goodness, why? We use Muscovy all the time. And he said, it just sounds so exotic, and it makes Russia sound exotic. No one knows what Muscovy means, and it makes it seem like the history of this part of the world that we study is even farther away from and more disconnected than the histories of early modern states in Central and Western Europe. And so he advocates abandoning the term Muscovy altogether. However, I've talked with other colleagues who are unwilling to abandon the term. I won't get into the weeds there, but I kind of just say that so that you know what this term Muscovy refers to and means, but at the same time, don't get so hung up on labels. Now, the next label we're gonna go, and I don't have one map here to show you of Muscovy because pretty much during the time that Muscovy exists, it is expanding territorially. You'll see what I mean in a little bit. What existed before Muscovy? There's this term Rus that you need to know about. Now, and I'll give you a warning, this term Rus is a very controversial term. And one of the reasons it's controversial, it has to do with the legacies of imperialism. If you, and we'll talk about that quite a bit. But here is a map that's taken from a Western Civ textbook showing kind of medieval, well, actually more Renaissance. This is a more kind of Renaissance moment. And it has just off to the east, Kievan Rus going from it doesn't lead all the way down to the Crimea. If you can see, here's Crimea, here's the Black Sea, and it doesn't have those boundaries coming all the way down. And that's fair enough because you have nomads that are kind of ruling, not the Rus, but ruling the steppe over here. And it doesn't quite extend throughout what we know as the whole Baltics. So that's sort of in a Western Civ book, a rendition of Kievan Rus. Here is a map that shows the major principalities. And when I think of principality, I kind of think of a kingdom or a little state of its own around the year 1100. And there are a number of different principalities that make up what we think of as Rus or Kievan Rus. So this map is roughly 1100. Here is a map from 1054. That's the end of the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, one of the first rulers of Kiev on our radar screen that has gone down in history as a successful ruler. He left monuments, architectural and written, to kind of really put Kiev on the map in some ways. This map I like because one thing you'll notice is that the boundaries are quite murky. Where this territory begins and ends isn't entirely clear. What states can do during this period, it doesn't really compare in terms of governmentality and a bureaucracy and the outreach that states have. And so it makes perfect sense that we might be a little bit unclear on where the boundaries of this state, of a particular state were. And that isn't unique to Kiev, even though you see on this map, the maps to the west have pretty clear boundaries. Maybe just the authors really wanted to, as we see in the label, they're focusing on Kiev and Rus here, not thinking so much about those other states around it. So those are sort of those terms. Rus, Muscovy, Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and Russia. Now if you ever hear, and I have in the past few years, I've heard newscasters talk about the Soviet Union as if it's an entity that still exists. And I think, oh no, we just need a little bit more historical literacy because the Soviet Union ended in 1991. Muscovy, it's murkier, but then this term Rus is murkier still. We'll revisit this again, but I kind of left this, I teased you with this controversy and why. One of the reasons is that Russia has been an empire, but there are Slavic nations to the west of Russia, including Belarus and Ukraine, that claim for themselves their own history. Meanwhile, Putin has insisted, he has said at some point that Ukrainians are really just little Russians, and for much of Ukrainian history, Russian produced documents do indeed call Ukraine Little Russia. And so there's this contest about who gets to claim its past, its legacy, the connections to the past. And so historians, one thing that I would want you to do is not to equate the medieval Rus lands or Kievan Rus with Russia. Kievan Rus was a kind of maybe rump state, if you will, that gave way to the Belarusian nation and Ukrainian nation and Russian nation. There are historical connections. We'll talk more about them. They're not the same thing. So I kind of, if you're ever talking to a Ukrainian and you just call Kievan Rus Russia, prepare for that Ukrainian to give you some pushback and say, hey, wait a minute, we have a different history and different we see that historical legacy differently. So that's sort of your heads up about how some of these geopolitical terms carry with them quite a bit of weight and meaning. Okay, now I want to just look at this space a little bit. Now, the Russian, I've just kind of gone through these terms, and I want to show you a series of maps that kind of make plain territorial expansion over the centuries. So this first map here, a map of Eurasia, and in my left-hand corner, you see a little yellow space, which is more or less the territory of Kievan Rus around the 11th century. So that's the thousands, right? 1000 to 1099 is the 11th century. Or would you say 1100? When does the century end? At any rate. And then this next map around the 15th century shows you the Grand Principality of Muscovy in the 1500s. So you'll see if that's Kievan Rus, and then Muscovy kind of moves north and it's contracted. So we see even a smaller state. Why is it? Why have we seen the state contraction? The Mongols, and we'll talk about the Mongols that they came. But Muscovy is sort of the Rurikid dynasty that establishes the Kievan state. It has branches that go in a variety of directions, but arguably a very successful branch of the Rurikid dynasty moves north, first to Vladimir, then to Muscovy, and establishes a state there, and that becomes the Muscovite state. And by the 16th century, it starts, 15th and then 16th century, it starts really expanding and gaining territory that it's kind of claiming suzerainty over. Under Ivan IV, that continues, even as after he dies, the state is going to have a real problem. It's going to see Swedish and Polish armies on its territory, even occupying Moscow in this time of troubles that is going to end with an army being rallied, ousting the Poles and bringing in the Romanov dynasty. And then under the Romanov dynasty, the empire expands tremendously. From if Ivan IV in 1681 or 1682 has, well, how much of a hand does he have in it? But if Russians start conquering Siberia in the early 1580s, by 1649, they're already on the Pacific coast. So even by the middle of the 17th century, they're here. In the 18th century, with Peter and Catherine, the empire sees a great deal more expansion. If in these earlier centuries, they really didn't want to get in the face of the Ottoman Empire too much. In the 18th century, that changes, and Russia really starts to flex its regional muscles and take on the Ottomans and win territory. And that's what moves Russia down into the Black Sea so that it can claim Crimea in an imperial annexation in 1783 and hold on to it this time. Peter the Great tried in the 1690s and it didn't work that well. The Ottomans took the territory back. But by the 18th century, Russia is not just a regional, it is a world power. And then in the 19th century, it sees a bit more expansion down into Central Asia. And also in the 18th century, by the 1740s, Russia claims Alaska. even though they have a hard time getting many people there. But so in the mid-19th century, the Russian Empire reaches its greatest extent. It will, shortly after the Crimean War, sell the territory of Alaska for a song to America, because it would rather have, it knew it couldn't really hang on to it, and it would rather have it sold to a more friendly nation. Yes, the US and Russia had friendly terms for much of the 19th century than the British state with which Russia saw as more of a rival. But so that is, in super broad sweeping, galloping terms, the history of Russian territorial expansion across these centuries. And then reminder to us in our course, we're going to pretty much look at Kiev and Rus. What was it? Talk about Muscovy and its initial expansion, and probably, well, actually they expand all the way across Siberia in the 17th century even. So somewhere between here and here is where we're going to wrap up our course in terms of territorial expansion. All right, here is just another map that sort of sets out some regions that you might think in terms of. And yeah, I won't put too much stock in it, but Muscovy is kind of that central Russian area. Siberia, the definition of Siberia is really is a moving target in history, as we'll see. Some Russians would always say this is the Far East, it's not really Siberia. In this map, I put it as Siberia. Here is the southern steppe region, grassland that well into the 18th century was really the domain of nomads, and the Russian state didn't succeed in establishing territorial claims in that part of the world for a long time. One thing that really struck me in doing my research for my first book is that the Russian state settles a town called Tara, which is in southwestern Siberia, in 1594. 1594, pretty early. The Russian state doesn't move south of that territorial claim around here until the 17 teens. So about a century and, almost a century and a quarter before this very expansionist state that moves like wildfire practically across the Eurasian taiga doesn't expand southward. And the Ottomans aren't really there. The reason they're not expanding southward is because nomads are still a going concern. Modernity kills nomads for the most part. Having really set territories and highways and things like that make it really hard for nomadic polities whose existence is based partially on migration to thrive. But up until the 18th century, nomads were very much a going concern. And I think, and they're a big part of the reason that the Russian expansion didn't move southward in the way that its eastward expansion did. These Western borderlands. The Western borderlands are a super complicated region in Russian history. And one of the reasons that they are so complicated is because of religion. And in terms of ethnicity and languages, they're not all, well, the whole Russian Empire, it isn't all Slavic, like as I said before, but the Western borderlands have also been populated by Germanic peoples, by Polish peoples who are Slavic, but tended to be more Catholic. So you had Catholics, once the Reformation started, you had different Lutherans and other Protestant faiths, and you had Orthodoxy, and it's really made for a dramatic and quite complicated mix of peoples. Also, you had a significant Jewish population because so many Western European states evicted Jews from living in their territory during the late medieval territories, and they went to various places. They went to the Ottoman Empire, some came to the New World, places like Curacao in South America had a huge Jewish population, and many also went eastward into Eastern Europe, where the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth did let Jews come in, did let Jews have land for a while, although more Jewish people, because they were forced because they couldn't own land, were forced to get literate and live in urban places. And so they were often put to work in those Western borderlands, working as bailiffs on these great landed estates in Poland in that during that a period known as the Second Serfdom, as well, let me not go too far down there, but so you had many Jews often working as bailiffs, which resulted often in them being bearing the brunt of discontent from their absentee landlords' requirements on the serf population, which I think maybe just one circumstance among many contributing to a real embedded anti-Semitism in much of these worlds. And that is just all to say, it's one more aspect that makes the history of the Western borderlands of the Russian Empire such a fascinating region. Okay, now, if I've just showed you all this, I say the space, really its spaces. And if we were going to talk a little bit about the physical geography and climate, the first thing to say is that there are climates. And here is, so it's not, when you think of Siberia, when you think of Russia, we often think cold. And to be sure, it is, much of it is located, I think, above the latitude of 52 degrees. So it is, so kind of the heartland and oldest part of Russia, not Kiev. Kiev is in a warmer place, but it was quite cold. And so those associations are real, and there's good reason that they obtain, but not all of Russia, and certainly not all of the Russian Empire were cold. And here is a map. These are maps that I am currently working on. As you see, I'm interested in maps, and some of these maps on this on the screen right now were perhaps, well, were sources that the guy who made this map used. At any rate, this map right here is a map of the steppe, and it has the naked steppe. And one of the notations on it that you can't read says no water. So much of this place was quite arid, although the Arctic is super arid too. It actually doesn't get much precipitation. I've even heard it called a desert, although it's a very different type of desert. It's cold, not hot. But parts of southern Russia were quite warm, were quite fertile. And then, but other parts of Russia, and this part of shows you some of the northern coast coming out of the rivers that empty into the Arctic Ocean, was really, really cold. And in this map, it even says up here that polar bears go along here, and you see icebergs, and it's not even really clear, I think, where the coast begins and ends, because it was covered in ice so much of the year. You might be wondering why, or that on this map, I'll just point out that north is right here on the side, which might confuse you a little bit, but it actually wasn't, when people first started making maps, there wasn't a standard convention that north was at the top. That became a convention during the early modern period in European map making. But in this map, we have north on the right side. And in even more maps of Russia, like for example, this one, north is at the bottom and south is at the top. So when you're—
Didn't north become the standard for map making like around the 15th or 16th century, when we started to get all these more advanced techniques for sailing stuff, because it was desperately needed for accurate sailing across the oceans?
It is in the early modern period that north becomes the typical convention for where to locate. It is during the early modern period that it becomes conventional and standard to locate north at the top of the map. Moving on, we have, so here are just a couple of maps that really quickly show the winter temperatures and duration of snow cover to kind of get a grip on that coldness. And so this white is a place where more than 180 days a year are covered in snow. So here, because because oceans and water play a mitigating role, as you may know from biology and geography classes, because big bodies of water play a mitigating role on temperature, a place like the middle of Eurasia, where there is no ocean or huge bodies of water anywhere in sight, tend to have harsher climates, where they'll have and it's somewhere up here in Yakutia, as a matter of fact, that has the coldest temperature in the winter and the hottest temperature in the summer. So that contributes to perhaps a harshness of life, and that people that live there need to be especially adaptable. Here is a map showing precipitation, and to be super general, much of Eurasia actually doesn't get enough precipitation to have really, really fertile agriculture. Down here towards these lands of Ukraine, fantastic soil, fantastic conditions for agriculture. It's why so much of Ukraine was called the breadbasket of the Russian Empire. Out here on the steppe, you have similarly fantastic fertile conditions that don't get farmed for a long time because of nomads. That you would try and go out and farm that, peasants would set up a village and nomads would come and they would kidnap them all, and then they would sell them down as slaves to row in the galleys on the Mediterranean or into the courts of Ottomans, or they figured out they could just sell them back to the Russian state, because the Russian state at some point decided that it was important to not let Christians be slaves under Muslims. So it developed a whole government department of buying back through ransom Christians that had been captured and sold to Muslim polities. So it meant that for centuries, a lot of really fertile territory didn't get farmed because of the threats of nomadic being raided and taken and kidnapped as a slave commodity by nomads. Here is a world map of climate zones, where you just see that so much of Russia is in either the tundra or boreal climate zone. To give you kind of some long perspective, here's some vegetation zones. I won't go into depth on these. These slides can be up on Learn and you can revisit them. And then this map here shows shows steppe regions. Here's mountain steppes, where kind of those absolutely stunning, picturesque pictures of Mongolian life. You've no doubt seen some of these on the internet. And here is a world of more arid steppe lands, where nomadizing was a way of life. And nomads, one thing that's said about nomads is a pure nomad is a poor nomad. So it's not that nomads just lived entirely isolated. They traded and raided, and they were involved in human slave raiding and trading, which was a big part of that dynamic. Here is another map that in green puts before you the steppes, and to sort of give a sense of areas over which nomads prevailed for much of the period that we're talking about. Here as well is a different map that shows, now here you can always orient. Here is the Black Sea, here is Crimea. So you know Ukraine is somewhere around here, Russia is up here, and you see this land, temperate forest, steppe, and then taiga, kind of trees, a lot of trees, evergreen trees. And then as you get farther and farther north, you'll have super old trees that are actually pretty little, because the weather is just so harsh that tree rings, as they grow very, very, very little over the years, but they really create remarkable forests. Why am I mentioning the steppe so much? Why am I showing you all these maps? This dynamic between the forest and the steppe is going to be really important for us for understanding the development of Muscovy, Rus Muscovy, and both how the state operates and security concerns, etc. So and how Slavs lived and adapted throughout the years. So There I've shown you some, we've looked at the space a little bit. We started out, covered some geopolitical terms. We've looked at this vast space that doesn't have just one climate. And I've made this point to you that the forest steppe dynamic is really important. And now before we kind of close out this first lecture, I want to say just a little bit about peoples around what becomes Rus territory. I'm going to hold off on talking about Slavic peoples until next time. So a little bit about their neighbors. Mostly I want you to take away, you know, Bulgars, Khazars, and nomads are various steppe people that this thing, and maybe empire is a little bit too neat of a word, but there is kind of the Khazar state, Khazar empire. The Bulgars are also in the area. Turkic nomads, I've already talked to you a lot about nomads without specifying any ethnicity. And some other names when we read the chronicles or bits of the chronicles will show up are Avars and Pechenegs, and there's a number of different tribes. So first, the Volga Bulgars. Who are the Volga Bulgars? The Volga Bulgars were a people that embraced Islam sometime in the 900s and that existed along the Volga River. And so that map in green sort of indicates the territory where they lived, where they built those first mosques. And and the reason that we know much about them at all is from, and about early Kiev's, early Viking-ish Rus types that were hanging out down near Kiev is because in the 900s, a traveler, Ibn Fadlan, traveled from Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic Caliphate, up through Bukhara to the Volga to talk about lending aid to this polity, the Bulgars, aid and support, both for kind of programs to teach the faith and military programs, because the Khazars were aggressive neighbors to their west, and they wanted some assistance from this other Muslim entity. And a man, Ibn Fadlan, went to talk about arrangements, and he wrote an account of his travels. On his way back, he couldn't go back the way he came, went through Kievan lands and left an account of kind of the Viking Rus behaviors that I'll tell you a little bit about later. I'm not assigning it to you this year, but it is a fascinating and really disturbing account of a Viking funeral. So one point to just point out is that when we talk about, when people talk about Russia, Volga, the Volga River, which goes from Moscow down into the Caspian Sea, is really considered to be the heartland of Russia. Well, it's up on the Volga River that you had a Muslim state before anyone on the territory of Kievan Rus embraced Christianity, or maybe about the same time. It's really murky. We're going to talk about these histories, but it's just something to know. And it's really important to know because in the 19th century, the Russian state associated orthodoxy with true Russianness. And so it's worth knowing that on this territory, you had a Muslim polity and many, many Muslims in the Russian Empire for centuries and centuries. The Bulgars are there on the Volga River, which is by no means Russian heartland during the time that we're talking about, but will come to be considered Russian heartland in the 19th century, when there's no longer a threat that if you're sailing down it, you'll get kidnapped and taken away to be a slave rower on some Ottoman galley, as Jenkinson, a danger that Jenkinson faced in the account that he read. Okay. Here is, well, let me skip this part for now to not go too much into the rest of the Muslim world. So Khazars, what are the Khazars? The Khazars are sort of the least known empire that we might know. A kind of murky history. They seem to have built a capital called Itil somewhere just off of the Volga River and its massive delta. So right down around here. And it was a state that exerted some sort of authority. And by that we mean, what do states do? Like at its most basic definition, a state is an entity that collects and redistributes resources according to some sort of procedure or principles, whatever that might be. And so the Khazars are a state to the extent that they are collecting tribute or taxes from people that travel through. They have an army. They are, demanding requiring some sort of tribute. They have a city, and they seem to have converted to Judaism, persuaded by travelers from the Roman Empire and traders in the ancient 5th and 6th centuries. Here, let's see if I have the book on my shelf that I could show you. I'm drawing on Folger's Religions of the Silk Roads interpretation now. But so at any rate, you have this state, the leadership of which embraces Judaism, but Judaism tends not to be a proselytizing religion, and they don't proselytize. They exist there from, maybe as early as the 7th century, but by the 11th century, they're no longer a concern. They did give Kiev to the west and the Volga Bulgars to the east a little bit of trouble. The documents kind of show provide some evidence of military confrontations. So they existed, and then before they passed from history. But it's lent itself to myths about a distant Jewish empire, which seems to be not the best characterization, even as the historical record does reflect that this leadership embraced Judaism. Here might be another map that just kind of shows some of this region that we're talking about. This puts the Volga Bulgars up here, and it names a bunch of other people. So it kind of has the Khazars here at the tip in this territory between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, this steppe lands. And there's also, so you have Volga Bulgars, Khazars I've talked to you about, and I haven't talked to you about Pechenegs and Bertas and Karluks and Magyars that will move westward and found Hungary, and Polanis and Severians and Derevyanis. These gray names right here actually are sort of Slavic tribes. And then the black names are nomadic tribes. And then these red towns on this map indicate early Slavic towns that will grow into quite big towns. So the geography in this period of the 500s, the 600s, the 700s, the 800s, the 900s is, we don't know so much about it, but this is an attempt to kind of put some places in red and identify certain peoples, nomads in the black and Slavs in the gray. And then this one map kind of talking about peoples is an attempt at a linguistic map to identify Turkic-speaking peoples of Eurasia. I'm not a linguist or an anthropologist, so I can't speak in great detail to this phenomenon, but people that do study these things have mapped out how Turkic language really traveled. And if kind of the Turkic language is identified here on the Anatolian Peninsula, which is now Turkey, how's that for some staying power of a name? The Mongols contributed to such a mixing for sure that some people even refer not so much to Mongolian language as Mongol Turkic language by the 13th century. And then you even have what this map I think is so fascinating and shows is some real linguistic spread all the way up here to where now the Sakha and Yakutia people live, but have incorporated aspects of Turkic language into the languages that they speak. I wish I knew more about this, but just thinking about this map and the movement and all the exchange that it entails, I find mind-blowing. All right, with that, I'm going to stop recording and wrap up and take questions. We will